Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our first virtual Marine Science Day. We are excited to have attendees from all over the world with us today. My name is Christy Pondell, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at VIMS. I will be your host for this session. In this session, we are excited to have Dr. Emily Rivest, an associate professor at VIMS, who will discuss the effects of climate change on oysters. Hi, Dr. Rivest.
Hi.
So we have a lot of questions coming in, so we're just going to get right to it. The first question is, do oysters like growing in high seagrass areas?
They can. Seagrass can be a great environment for oysters to grow in because seagrass can help to protect the oysters from experiencing such dramatic effects of acidification. And that's because the seagrass can actually remove some of that CO2 from the water we learned about in the video. And they do that through a process called photosynthesis that all plants do, where they're creating food for themselves, energy for themselves by converting that CO2 into sugar. And so locally, they will remove the CO2 from the water, and that makes the water less acidic, and then the oysters may have a better environment to grow in.
Excellent. Are there any species that are adapted to climate change or will do better because of it?
Will do better because of it. Well, so if we consider in the plant scenario, some scientists have hypothesized that plants might benefit from climate change because there will be more CO2 for them. So as I just mentioned, they need that to create food for themselves. So if it's more abundant in the environment, then they could make more food for themselves, but they can also be limited by other things. So it may not end up helping them too much in the end. A lot of the work that I do at VIMS is focused on trying to understand what causes animals like oysters to be more or less sensitive to climate change. And there's a lot of research all around the world looking into that. So there are certainly some species that are more sensitive than others, but even within a species, so within the eastern oyster, we're trying to find out if there are certain populations that may have special tools for tolerating more acidic conditions, and maybe we can learn from that and help oysters all throughout the bay or in the aquaculture industry become more tolerant to the changing environment around them.
So there have been reports that during quarantine, we're actually improving climate change because there are fewer cars. Is that true?
From what I've read, since people aren't driving to work, they're working from home. We don't have as much public transportation going on. There are maybe some factories that are less active. We are burning less fossil fuel during that time. So we're not reversing climate change. We're just slowing the rate of our CO2 emissions. But it's a really great example, a direct example of the role that humans are playing in changing the atmosphere. And so I'm really glad that you took notice, and hopefully you can help us keep the emissions down moving forward.
Another question is, how do you assess the health of these oysters under the microscope?
Sure, there are a couple of things we can look at under the microscope. The other aspects of stress that Annie mentioned in the video, we need more sophisticated tools to look at them, but we can learn a lot about how the larvae are doing just by visually observing them under the microscope. So one of the things that we look for is their color. Their color can tell us a lot about how well they're feeding and how well they're growing. So we want to be able to see that their belly is full and that their tissue is fully occupying the little shell that they make at that early life stage. We can also look at how active they are. So Annie showed a video of some larvae kind of swimming in circles around the microscope, under the microscope. So the way that the oysters move at that early stage is they have a ring of hairs that beat. They're called cilia. And so we want to see the active beating. We want to see them moving around. If they're kind of sedentary and not swimming very much, then that could mean that they're not feeling very well. The other thing that we look for under the microscope is how many larvae there are. So we can measure survival by comparing how many larvae we see on one day compared to the previous day. And we can also measure how big they are. So in the video, Annie was taking pictures of the larvae, and from the pictures, we can measure the maximum length of the larvae and the size of the area of their shell. And we can compare that from day to day to see how quickly they're growing.
Excellent. What are some of the most exciting conclusions that you've come to through your research?
Oh, there are so many to talk about. It's hard to pick one, but I will focus on one idea that we're working on right now that came out of Annie's work that she presented in the video. So she mentioned that one of the things we look at is oxidative stress, and the larvae produce these molecules called antioxidants that help them fight that stress. So if they're experiencing stress, we would see high levels of these protective molecules that they make. And one thing that we've observed recently is that the eggs of the oysters are full of these molecules. And so it could be that the mothers are providing this gift of defense to their offspring by loading up the eggs with these molecules, so that during those first few days after the egg is fertilized and that initial development is occurring, the baby oysters have a way of fighting this stress as they're getting their own physiology going. So this is a really interesting process that we want to follow up on with some more studies.
That is really exciting. Awesome. Another question is, higher temperatures usually mean higher metabolic rates. So is that true for oysters as well?
Yes, it is true. We've seen that in our larvae, and we also see that in our studies with juvenile and adult oysters.
Excellent. All right, so one question here is, have you noticed any contamination of the water supply due to fracking in the Chesapeake Bay watershed?
I haven't personally, no. I don't know if there is fracking in our area, and for us, we don't measure the chemical contaminants that come from fracking. That's a good question.
Another question that was asked is, what types of things did you have to do in order to become an oyster scientist?
Sure. So I would say when I was in college, I knew I wanted to study biology and chemistry, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that. And it wasn't until I got involved in research as an undergraduate that I really fell in love with that process, and that sort of set me on the path that I am. So for all the students out there, I would definitely recommend taking advantage of all the opportunities you have to gain experience working with your hands and trying different things out. I started off as a volunteer in a research lab when I was an undergraduate student, and really liked the kind of work that was going on, and sort of worked my way up to doing my own little project in the lab, and that convinced me that I would be really happy pursuing a career in research. So I decided to apply to graduate school, and it all went from there. So I just caught the bug of marine research and marine science from that one volunteer experience.
Excellent. So there's a couple of questions here about the experimental process. So can you go into a little bit of detail into that, including how long does it take and how big are the tanks that these oysters are raised in?
Sure. So the process of the experiment that we do to look at the larvae. So this period in the oyster's life is only about 2 weeks long. And we start with adult oysters. So there are male and female oysters, and they become ready to spawn in the springtime. And so their process of reproducing is they will actually release their eggs and sperm into the water, where those two somehow find each other, and the sperm fertilizes the egg, and the larvae will develop from there. we need to do that in a more controlled way in the lab. So what we do is we actually open up the adult oysters and we will collect the eggs and sperm and perform the fertilization ourselves in cups. And then we will add those fertilized eggs to the tanks and that you saw in the picture in the presentation. And then we'll raise the oyster babies in those tanks for 2 weeks. As you can imagine, keeping track of millions and millions of microscopic oysters is really challenging. So we have to be very careful with the way we clean them. They're also really vulnerable to getting infections from bacteria. So 3 days a week, we will actually drain the tanks and collect the larvae on the sieves like you saw in the presentation. We'll clean the tanks and look at the larvae under the microscope, collect any samples we want, and then put the larvae back in the tanks. After about 24 hours from fertilization, the larvae start looking for food. And so we feed the larvae once a day, and they eat phytoplankton, which are single-celled algae that live in the same water environment in the bay that the oysters do. So we get these big flasks of phytoplankton and pour them into the tanks for the larvae to eat each day. What was the second part of the question?
I think you answered it. So it was, how long does it take, which sounds about 2 weeks, and how big are the tanks?
Yeah, the tanks that we use are 100 liters. But if you were to look at how other people raise oyster larvae, especially in hatcheries, which are businesses that raise oyster larvae for the aquaculture industry, the tanks can be as big as a swimming pool. So ours are relatively small compared to that size.
Excellent. Well, thank you. It looks like that's all the time that we have for today. Dr. Rivest, thank you so much for being here and helping us to learn a little bit more about the effects of climate change on oysters. It has been a pleasure. We want to thank First Advantage Credit Union for supporting this session, and have a great day.
And thanks everyone. Have a great Marine Science Day.